Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Friday, July 29th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are in the world. First of all, I want to say happy Friday to everyone. We're coming to the end of our first week of this podcast, and I hope you've enjoyed listening every day. I wasn't sure what to expect when I started out, but the response to these first episodes has been incredibly supportive, and I already look forward to another week of fun speculation and discussion. A quick reminder at the top of the episode, this show is now available on all major podcast platforms. Whether you listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any others, make sure to subscribe so you never miss your daily dose of the Rings of Power. To close the week, I thought long and hard about what passage to choose from the professor's work to read in today's show. In the end, I chose one of my favourite passages from The Lord of the Rings, Book 2, The Council of Elrond. Elrond raised his eyes and looked at him, and Frodo felt his heart pierced by the sudden keenness of the glance. "If I understand aright all that I have heard," he said, "I think that this task is appointed for you, Frodo, and that if you do not find a way, no one will. This is the hour of the Shire folk, when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great. Who of all the wise could have foreseen it? Or, if they are wise, why should they expect to know it until the hour has struck? But it is a heavy burden, so heavy that none could lay it on another. I do not lay it on you. But if you take it freely, I will say that your choice is right. And though all the mighty elf friends of old, Hador and Húrin, and Túrin and Beren himself, were assembled together, your seat should be among them." At the end of a very long week, I think it's quite fitting to think of the courage of hobbits, and that everyday acts of courage can raise each one of us up to be on a par with heroes of myth and legend. And apart from that, it's just a lovely piece of dialogue. For today's episode, we're going to return to our recap format that we took on for our pilot episode. There has been an overwhelming amount of interviews released from the outlets that attended Comic-Con and were able to interview the cast. So today, I'd like to take us through the 8 interview snippets released by Collider. We'll take a look at each of these, unpack the quotes from the cast, and perhaps even draw some connections with details about their characters that have previously been released. As always, the links to these articles are in the show notes. First up, we have a couple of quotes from Sophia Nomvetti, who plays the dwarven princess Disa, wife to the heir of Khazad-dûm, Durin IV. Speaking about the relationship between Durin and Disa, Sophia points out a key difference between the two. "I think the biggest difference is that Durin is torn and Disa is not. Disa knows exactly what it is that she wants, and that she thinks is right for her and her husband and her kingdom." She later adds, "And of course, Durin has so much to contend with his father, with Elrond, and our relationship, so there's a little bit of to and fro for him." I think these quotes illustrate exactly why it's so smart for the show to have an equal counterpart for Durin. As we've seen from the trailers and heard through interviews, it seems that Durin's father, the king, has a very insular approach to his kingdom. In contrast, Prince Durin clearly has a long-standing, if complicated, relationship with the likes of Celebrimbor and Elrond. Having Disa be a voice not only of support, but with her own vision, will allow us to see Durin wrangle with his future and the fate of his people. This is something that will only become more important once the dwarves, including Durin, receive a ring of power. Will Disa be a counterbalance to the ring's influence, or will we see their relationship become strained under the weight of the ring's power? Next up, we have another original character, this time an interview with Tyro Muhaffedin, who plays the child of Bronwyn, who both live in Tir Harad, a name that interestingly means Southwatch in Sindarin. Tyro shed some light not only on his character's history, but also the history of his people, the inhabitants of Tir Harad, and their relationship with their watchful neighbours, the Sylvan Elves. Explaining the background of his ancestors, Tyro says, quote, Theo's ancestors sided with Morgoth and fought against the elves, and so in punishment for their doing that, they got banished and had to restart in almost the slums of the Southlands, and it's patrolled by the elves. Tyro goes on to nicely illustrate one of the key themes the show will explore: the unique perspectives of humans who live relatively short lives and the elves who see centuries come and go. Tyro continues, it was generations ago, and Theo thinks, and Bronwyn thinks, and I think the whole village thinks that it's time to move past it and move forward. But the elves just won't forget, so there's a lot of tension in there. Clearly, the show is exploring the idea that men have always been the most susceptible to the corruption of darkness. In fact, I do believe they may be drawing on the following line from the Silmarillion. It is said by the Eldar that men came into the world in the time of the shadow of Morgoth, and they fell swiftly under his dominion. For he sent emissaries among them, and they listened to his evil and cunning words, and they worshipped the darkness, and yet feared it. Now, I know a lot of people suspect that Theo is being set up to become one of the 9 who took a ring of power and became a ringwraith. Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest it's possible, but I'm always conscious of TV shows trying to point an audience in one direction, especially in marketing. Whichever way the show does go with Theo's character, I'm glad we're getting to see more of the men of Middle-earth in the Second Age, rather than solely focusing on Numenor. As we mentioned above, Bronwyn, played by Nazanin Boniardi, will play a key role in Theo's development as well as her own story. One of the core elements of her story, alongside being a healer and Theo's mother, is her romance with the sylvan elf Arondir. Speaking about this story, Nazanin says, it's the forbidden aspect of an elf and a human are not supposed to be together. But on the other hand, they're both sort of outcasts. They feel misplaced among their own beings. You know, him as an elf, he's a poor elf's elf. And I'm a poor man's human. Not only am I deeply interested in the subplot between these two, as I think it will mirror the story of Andreth and Aegnor, allowing the show to explore the themes of mortality and love that we see in the Athrabeth. I also love that the show is playing with the idea of subcultures within these races. I hope we get to see plenty of the ways in which Númenóreans feel superior over the humans of Middle-earth, and also the way in which there are long-standing differences between the Noldor characters like Galadriel and Gil-galad and the Sylvan Elves. Markella Kavanagh, who plays the half-foot Nori Brandyfoot, also provided a short quote to Collider. She mainly talks about the elements of the character we've already heard about, her curiosity, her need to explore and go outside half-foot tradition. However, I did find this quote interesting. I thought that it just made sense to ground that in wanting to subvert Harfoot tradition, to improve the quality of life, and that's where the curiosity into the unknown comes from as well. She leads with the idea that a fear of risk can be greater than the risk itself. The idea of courage in the face of fear is one that resonates deeply with my own reading of Tolkien, and I like that Nori is not reckless for the sake of recklessness. It's in search of helping her people. After the Harfoots came Charlie Vickers, who plays Halbrand, a character we have very little information about. We know that he ends up as a castaway on the raft with Galadriel, that they both return to Middle-earth with the Númenórean army, and that according to the February Vanity Fair article, he is running from his past. But we know so little else. Charlie offers this piece of insight in the interview. There's a chance had he not met her, that his life might have not gone on. So I think that their fates crossing paths opens up this whole world for Hal, and makes him question so many things in his past, and then it also makes him reassess the kind of man he might be in the future. I love this quote, because it gives us so many possibilities. Is this the start of a redemption arc for a broken character? Or is this someone who has given up but will now be driven by purpose, a purpose that could lead to him being a prime candidate for future corruption by Sauron? We'll have to wait and see. Staying in Númenor, we also got one of our first interviews with Leon Wadham, who plays the original character of Pharazôn's son, Kemen. As I talked about in yesterday's episode, I suspect the internal politics of Númenor will play a major role in Season 1. As for Kemen's relationship with his powerful and ambitious father, Leon says the following: I think the children of powerful people can fall into two categories, you could argue. They can try and match and outdo their parents, or they can coast with a level of entitlement. And I think he's more in that category at the point we meet him. Now, the trope of powerful children being spoilt is not an uncommon one in fiction, and it could be slightly tired. But I think Leon's follow-up to this is very revealing. He says, I think his dad's frustration with him is that he's not bringing any new ideas to the table, because the ideas of the day have served him really well personally. I suspect that this relationship is going to be key to showing that Númenor is at a tipping point in terms of the ideals it represents. Will it return to the days of friendship and allegiance with the elves, or will it increasingly turn inward-looking and in doing this sow the seeds of its own ruin? While book readers will be well aware of how this story ends, for new viewers this will be an interesting plot to follow. In our final Númenor interview, we hear from Lloyd Owen, who plays the legendary Elendil. He starts by providing some interesting character background. He not only confirms that he has 3 adult children, a reassuring sign that Anarion will be present in the series, but also that their mother has recently died. This is something the show has freedom to explore, given Elendil's wife is absent from the books. However, Lloyd is at his most engaging when discussing Tolkien's broader themes as it relates to his character. I think it's very Tolkienian, the idea that when all of these characters, that they suddenly realised where their fate lies. They understand that they have a fate, and so it's a battle that we all have as humans, between your head and your heart. It's clear to me that Lloyd Owen not only gets Tolkien, but also how those wider themes relate to Elendil as a character. He also talks about the need to flesh out the sketch of Elendil we have seen that takes him to the Battle of the Last Alliance. How does he get there? Not in a physical sense, of course, but his internal journey to becoming that heroic figure of the Third Age. Finally, Benjamin Walker, who plays Gil-galad, comes across once again to me as someone with a very clearly defined idea of the wider themes of the Second Age. One of love and loss and grief and hope. I won't retread all that here because I've talked about this subject at length, but there is an interesting snippet in this interview. When it's time for action and he needs proper counsel, he goes to Celebrimbor. They have a shared experience and understanding of loss and also the importance of reinvesting in protecting Middle-earth. I'm really glad the show is not portraying Gil-galad and Celebrimbor's relationship as cold. There may be tension there based on their family's history and different outlooks, but it's important for the audience to start the show with this sense of kinship. After all, Celebrimbor is not a character who is set to fall inevitably. It is his encounters and interactions with Sauron, in the fair form of Anatar, that will sadly shape his tragic fate. Well, I hope you enjoyed my roundup of these interviews and found some interesting nuggets of information in there. But for today, that's all we have time for. As I said at the beginning, this show is now available on all major podcast platforms. It would mean so much to me if you could take the time to leave a rating or review where possible, and do subscribe so that you never miss an episode. I'd also love to continue this conversation on Twitter, so drop me a comment and let me know what your thoughts are, either on these interviews or the characters we discussed today. I've greatly enjoyed the conversations I've had with some of you just this week. A final note, as this is a Friday, there will be no new episodes over the weekend. Believe me, I would love to do this 7 days a week, but even a humble Twitter admin and podcast host does need a day or two off every week. Have no fear though, for we will be back bright and early on Monday with a new episode of the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namaria.